Hi, everyone. My name is Lexi Tudnam, and I want to welcome you to the virtual version of our Fall 2023 Changemakers gathering. We are recreating some of the points that we made in person last week at our Changemakers gathering at Red Iguana because it was difficult to record there. So we are going to cover all the same good points, and we look forward to your feedback, your questions, and so on and so forth that will be submitted by email in this case. So first off, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being our supporters throughout the years. Thank you for being this strong community that allows us to do what we do. My name is Lexi Tudnam, and since 2022, I've had the honor of being the executive director at Heal Utah. Prior to that, I was working on conservation land work, and I was really lucky and excited to be able to start working on things like air quality once I arrived here in Utah, where I'm raising my family. So, the Healthy Environment Alliance of Utah, or HEAL Utah, was formed in the late 90s by a group of citizens who came together out in Tooele because they were really concerned about the combined effects of a weapons incinerator, along with nuclear weapons testing out in the West Desert and beyond, on their health. In short, these people and the landscape that they were living in were being sacrificed in service to decisions that they had had no part in whatsoever. At the time, we were known as FAIR, or Families Against Incinerator Risk. What HEAL's founders were able to do at that time was to organize a community to advocate for themselves and to shine a spotlight on what was happening around them, bringing state and national attention to the issue and to eventually bring about better regulation. That is still what we do today. At this particular event, we were able to share an essay from Chip Ward, who was one of our founders. I will be sending along with this entire packet and this video recording. But a little bit of context for that essay is that I reached out to him this summer when I heard that the last of the US chemical weapons inventory had been destroyed. And I felt like what he has to say here still really does resonate. So in the early 2000s, HEAL moved our base to the Wasatch Front, and now as HEAL Utah, or the Healthy Environment Alliance of Utah. We were one of the first organizations to work on air quality here. As you've seen over the last couple of weeks, however, our work is not yet done. Today, as an organization, we prioritize three main issues that pose a profound threat to the health, quality of life, and economic vitality of our state. And those are air quality, climate change, and hazardous and radioactive exposure. Now, as the nonprofit space in Utah has developed, we've seen the expansion of work on climate change and air quality to many organizations working on the same issue from different angles. I fundamentally think that this is a really good thing that builds a robust ecosystem of people who can diversify and take different approaches to advance and leverage our collective voices as a whole to advance better policy. However, we do get asked with some frequency, what sets you apart? So, we're going to get more in depth in this in the how we work section, but I want to give a brief overview of how I think about that. So one of the first things for us is that HEAL takes the alliance part of our name very, very seriously. We are the Healthy Alliance of Utah. And we work with housing advocates like NeighborWorks, we work like groups like Comunidades Unidas to share our expertise on environmental issues, as well as with many other environmental groups to leverage our collective powers I've mentioned. Secondly, since our very beginning, we've linked environmental health with public health and the health of our civic environment. That's why grassroots organizing of communities to advocate for policy solutions that truly meet their needs is still at our core of what we do. We believe that the public needs to be a key part of the decision-making process, and we are the glue that hold it together. We connect policymakers to advocates, and we connect researchers to communities to make sure that the policy that's being created that makes decisions about people's future is actually grounded in what is needed by those communities. We put people and communities at the center of everything that we do. That's why we get invited in to work on real world problems, like the I-15 expansion, for example, that communities are facing today. Finally, we are there for the difficult fights that no one else wants to take on in many cases. We aren't willing to look away when a proposed solution to climate change, like nuclear energy, promises to create more harm, fundamentally because it will sacrifice victims, communities, and we believe that we can do better than that. These are long-term fights, but we can and do succeed. with some frequency. Just recently, after 6 years of sounding the alarm about the NuScale small modular reactor project, it was canceled. This was proof positive that our model works. We worked with unlikely partners like the Utah Taxpayers Association to find common cause, as well as alongside municipalities and citizens concerned about their energy future. And we stuck with it through multiple off-ramps and iterations for many, many years to the bitter end. So now in 2024, HEAL will be coming up on our 25th anniversary as an organization. In anticipation of this milestone, we embarked upon a strategic planning process last year. One impetus for this was the rapid changes we are seeing in both our political and demographic landscape here in Utah. Anyone can tell you, politics at the state capitol are more polarized than ever, and it's harder to get things done, especially as a group that is known as being environmental. At the same time, the rapid growth of our population that we're seeing right now is putting new stressors on our resources and on the livability of our future here. And we really want to be able to live here for the long term. But I also think another reason for our strategic planning process has been that it's critical as an organization to regularly look inward, to examine your reasons for existence, your mission, your theory of change, as well as your effectiveness in meeting goals that you are setting out. So in this extremely dynamic environment, we took a deep look at ourselves and most importantly, at the needs of our communities. We brought together our staff and board. We held focus groups on the west side of Salt Lake City and down in southern Utah. We surveyed other organizations that we work with, as well as others who are outside of our personal space. And we developed solutions from this entire process to address the challenges we're seeing. So in broad strokes, here are a couple of the initiatives that we are launching this next year. We have long been known for our policy work during the legislative session. We've been known for our bill tracker, for our community lobbying work, as well as the robust analysis that we bring to this incredibly, sometimes opaque legislative speak that determines the future of our state in terms of the policies that are being written. We are not going to stop that. However, as we've seen increasing gridlock at the state level, we're also turning our focus to activate local pilot municipal programs to create tangible change, as well as models for policy changes, like better access to public transit, for example, that will also at the same time build power at the state level over the longer term. So that gives us something tangible in the meantime, as we are finding more difficulty at the state level, while also creating that longer term view of how we can create the state level change. In addition to that, we're also doubling down on our public health focus. We've always been known for our public health work because, as Chip Ward put it, and you'll hear me reference him a couple times tonight, the closest relationship many of us have to our environment is through our bloodstreams themselves. So part of our focus this year is to partner more closely with public health organizations, public health agencies even, to address threats to vulnerable populations like extreme heat and air pollution. At this point now, I'm going to pass it over to Melanie to tell you a little bit more about how we work.
Thank you, Lexi. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk a little bit about HEAL today. My name is Melanie Hall, and I'm the policy director. I've been with HEAL about 1.5 years, and I've had the opportunity to start when the organization was really looking inward and looking at where we're going, but also where we've been. I'm particularly excited about that because I come in from a history background. And as an historian, I love to know the past. And I love to make sure that we are centered in what is best about HEAL and moving that forward as we move through the century. So one of the things that we've been doing is really articulating our core values and what our goals are as an organization. And so something that we're doing right now is we're going to rework our website. We're very excited about this. But we're kind of doing a soft launch of letting everybody know how we're framing the issues that we're facing and how we plan on addressing them. So I want to go through them with you and give you an opportunity to just hear from us and what we think our 4 main goals are, and then our approach to achieving these. So first is to protect communities from air pollution. We believe that action on air pollution is action on climate change, that advocating for clean air is one of the most immediate ways we can protect communities and the environment. That's why HEAL Utah works to strengthen and defend regulation and air quality standards while supporting policies and strategies that prioritize public health and frontline communities. Second, to build an inclusive energy future. We believe that our energy system should be built for the people it serves, that advocating for clean energy requires a holistic approach. That's why Heal Utah works to advance a clean energy future that not only reduces emissions and stabilizes the climate, but also promotes adaptation, resilience, health equity, and economic opportunity in our communities. Third, we work to build climate resilience and health equity. We recognize that climate change is a threat to public health and that these health risks, from worsening air quality to extreme heat, have disproportionate effects due to the greater exposure of historically underserved communities to environmental hazards and their risk of exclusion from adaptive measures. That's why Heal Utah advances climate resilience strategies that prioritize public health and frontline communities. And finally, we work to protect communities from radioactive and toxic exposure. We recognize that radioactive and toxic materials pose an environmental and public health crisis in tandem with our climate crisis. Consequently, Heal Utah believes that there is no inclusive energy future if we continue to ignore the impacts of extraction and waste on public health and frontline communities. When it comes to past, present, and future harms, we must stand with and protect Utah's communities. So the approach that we take to this is that we advocate for Utah's environment and people by enforcing and strengthening regulation while holding agencies, institutions, and industries accountable. We close the gap between community members, lawmakers, and researchers to ensure that policies are evidence-driven and based on community concerns. We listen to and elevate community voices by building effective partnerships and bringing allies together. And we advance civic engagement and inform participation in government decision-making to build a healthy democracy in Utah. So there's a few ways that we've been doing that over the past year that I think are really important and worth talking about tonight. So one of them is our work on I-15. And this is something that started almost a year ago now, and it's been really successful for us. And it started with just having the community who will be most impacted by expansion reach out to us. And they wanted to hear from us and have us be at the table. And in the process, it turned out that we really did bring not just our focus on clean air and clean energy and waste to the table, but also our expertise in understanding regulations and understanding agencies. And we've been really effective there. But I think one of the things that I'm most proud of in this campaign that we've been working on is that we started from the approach of asking the community what it was they wanted. So we built a coalition and we named it that was essentially blank over freeways or over freeways. And we invited the public to think about what they wanted and to really imagine a future that they could have that wasn't driven by spending $3.7 billion on expanding a freeway for just a few miles. And so in that process, we got people telling us all of the different things that they imagined for their community, from clean air and clean energy to a new high school and possibly a unicorn. And these are very exciting things for me because we were able to go through it and give us an impression of really like the larger picture of community wants and community needs. And what ended up happening was that when we had the draft environmental impact statement due, we submitted our technical comments. We were also able to submit over 400 comments from the public about why they didn't think this was an appropriate move for UDOT, our state, and the Wasatch Front Regional Council. And so we're really excited to have that voice on the West Side and to be able to understand that. And then within days of being able to submit those comments, we even had a meeting with Salt Lake City. And when they found out that we had access to this incredible archive of information from the West Side, they asked that we present it to them. And so our next step in this process is to really build a presentation about these are the concerns of community members, particularly frontline community members, when we were talking about clean air and clean energy and access or exposure to toxic and radioactive waste. And so we're going to be able to continue like using this kind of information and model this in some of our other campaigns as well, and really start from the premise that we want to know what the community wants, and then we want to advocate for that in all of the places that we are working. And then the second thing that we're very excited about that Lexi touched on briefly was NewScale. And this was also a community approach that in some respects we had to be behind the scenes. We had to like have other voices out there, but we were the organization that was really understanding this issue. So from across the nation, if they wanted to understand what was happening with NewScale and the UAMPS communities in Utah, they reached out to HEAL. They came to us to find out what was happening. And the reason we knew is because we took the time to listen to things like power board meetings and listen to what they were saying and what their needs were. And we see this not as look, we won and it's over. We see this as now, like we've gained all of this information and we know what their clean energy needs are. So we can go back to the community and actually talk to them and help advocate for them, for their needs, and not just see this as you don't get this one power and then we take off. But instead, we're embedded in this space and embedded in these goals, and we want to be there for communities. And we are also deeply concerned as we move forward. NewScale was one company, was one plan. The next one that we're facing is TerraPower. And we're even more concerned about that because there are so many promises for jobs. So we have coal communities that are really planning on being able to slide from the position they're in now into a nuclear energy position. And we're deeply concerned that with costs, with timelines, and with just the history of this industry, that is not going to be a possibility. And so he will continue to advocate, even in the uncomfortable space of talking about nuclear energy, continue to advocate for people to make sure that the jobs are there for them when they need it. And so in this space as well, we've been able to work with labor. And we're not always on the same page. Like, I totally understand why they're advocating for nuclear energy. It's been promised to them in ways that are very seductive. But we can be there, we can disagree and find our agreements when we need to, and really respect one another. And they know that no matter what, we're going to help them find the right transition that works for their community and reduces harm. And then finally, we're really excited about our work over the past year in the Uinta Basin. We've been able to really, through the legislative process, we learned about the Uinta Basin Research Center and the funding that they were going to need to be able to expand on the work they're doing to understand wintertime ozone. So what we did is we reached out to the lead researcher there, and Dr. Seth Lyman, and he's a wonderful human being that we've become very close with and really appreciate his expertise. And he's brought us into the community in ways that are really effective and important for HEAL. So we were able to meet with community members and again, talk to them about what their concerns are, what their needs are. And so on the one hand, air quality is absolutely top of mind for them, but so are things like transportation and public transportation, active transportation, and safe transportation. And so we're going to continue to work in this community to be able to get them things that are obviously cleaner air, healthier, so they breathe in healthy air, but also access to a transportation system that works for them. And we'll continue to work with Seth in a lot of opportunities that are coming up. We're really excited that he's reached out with a possible grant opportunity for us to do community engagement in the public in the Uinta Basin regarding wintertime ozone and the public health concerns that they have. And so we'll keep moving forward and looking forward to all of these incredible opportunities where we get to work with different organizations, different communities, and different research groups. And so I'm ending on that note because I think it is a good transition to talk about the work that we've done with Dr. Daniel Mendoza and why HEAL feels like it's so important that you hear from him. So let me take this opportunity to have Lexi introduce you to Dr. Mendoza.
Thank you so much, Melanie. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Mendoza, who is one of our favorite people to work with ever at HEAL. Dr. Daniel Mendoza holds joint appointments as Research Assistant Professor in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences and Adjunct Assistant Professor in the Pulmonary Division in the School of Medicine at the University of Utah, as well as in the Department of City and Metropolitan Planning. His research interests include quantifying and characterizing urban greenhouse gas, criteria, pollutant emissions, and temperature for use in human exposure estimation and metropolitan planning. He also examines the health effects associated with acute and chronic pollutant exposure, particularly in vulnerable populations. He is the co-director of the Consortium for Dark Sky Studies, serves as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Dark Sky Studies, and is the director for the Dark Sky Studies minor and instructor of the capstone class on Dark Sky Studies at the University of Utah. And we're really pleased to be able to invite him as both a frequent collaborator and our keynote speaker. Thank you, Daniel.
Great. Thank you, Lexi. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm sorry I missed you all. This is why we wanted to have the recording actually for you to take a look at. The event was wonderful, by the way. We had really amazing food. So hopefully we catch you next year. So I'd like to bring this to our attention. It was a little bit more dramatic when I gave it live because our skies looked like this. If you can see this from my cover image here. This are unfortunately our wintertime inversion. This is a view from my lab here at the University of Utah on the seventh floor of the WBB building. And we can see this unfortunate occurrence that really happens during our winter time. So I always like to start off with that so that you can kind of really get some visual perspective. I know, unfortunately, many of us live in that reality, and this is something that really propels our research and the reason why we study air quality. And now, recently, also looking at other environmental exposures such as elevated heat events. So here is a picture of the filters of the air purifier that I have in my home. Now, I live in my house is located in one of the cleaner areas in Salt Lake City. And despite that, this is what gets caught. Now, if we're live, I would ask you to raise your hands and I'd rattle off number of months. But I'll just give you the answer. This took about 2.5 months to get from the new filter into a dirty filter. So those are the four stages of filtration here. And what we really need to be thinking about is that if the filters weren't catching that pollution, that's what would be going into our lungs. This is a substantial problem because, again, I've taken substantial care to make sure that my indoor environment is fairly clean. I am an asthma patient. I've had asthma since I was a child, so I'm very careful with the air that I breathe because I know that it can have negative health consequences. So as Lexi mentioned, we've collaborated, and HEAL is really one of my favorite organizations to work with. I think that the work that they're doing is great, and I know Melanie and Lexi have talked about some of their goals and some of the projects they're working on. And really, what I'd like to discuss are really 7 points. First of all, environment is within uh, the really the main focus that I would say that really attracts me to working with Heal. I think that really concerning ourselves and realizing that we all breathe similar air. I would like to, I'm not going to go as far as to say we all breathe the same air because it really depends on where you are, but the pollution gets everywhere. Maybe to less degrees in some places, maybe to more degrees in other places, but we need to be really thinking about the environment because that's something we can't escape. We can't get away without breathing. That's not going to happen. But then heal really is very solution driven. It's not necessarily pointing out the problems that we have. We know we have air quality problems. We know we have other environmental concerns, but it's not just saying the doom and gloom. It's to provide solutions, it's to provide ways to move forward. The community engagement, I mean, this is something that we really need to make sure the community is behind these efforts. It's not necessarily an academic pursuit, it's not a research pursuit only, exclusively. We want to make sure that everyone is aware of this. And so they can decide and they can be a part of the solution, be a part of reaching out to stakeholders, to decision makers. And Heal's also really everyone there is a thought leader. When I've been discussing very recently with Lexi and her team, the possibility of applying for different environmental justice grants and other environmental focus grants, I'm always impressed by their desire to really, first of all, look at this from a multidisciplinary perspective and not just say we're going to be looking at this one thing and we're going to do it one way, but how can we reach a broader audience? How can we make solutions out of this problem? And because of that, they've gained great respect within the community. Heal Utah is a respected group, it's a respected organization that many people, whether they're community members, whether legislators, have substantial respect for. And so this is really a group that I am very happy to have met. I've worked with Heal since probably about 2015, so we're nearing more than 8 years, and they've always been friendly and they've always been amazing to work with. So I can't speak highly enough of Heal Utah. So I'm going to very quickly give you an overview of some of the work that we've been doing and really highlight some of the tie-ins and some of the collaborations that we've established. So for the research group that I lead, the main goal is to develop equitable, inclusive environments. So we first look at the environmental exposure, whether it's modeling or whether it's direct measurements, to then really put together the health tie-ins. So for example, if we take a look at the inversion image that I showed earlier, how would that affect health? What are the outcomes? And then we try to put some economic metrics to it. So not only saying, well, because we have this much pollution is going to lead to, say, 20% higher hospitalizations, but then on top of that, add what does that mean in cost? Because ultimately that's going to help shape public policy, which ultimately, and again, urban planning, it's a very catch-all term. To me, or to the way that we use it, it could be things such as discussing the impacts of road development, of residential, commercial development, etc. And then we can model the impacts of proposed solutions. So then we can give really a more educated estimation of impacts of action or in sometimes inaction. Now, this is really, there was a full picture up until around 2019, but as we know, 2020 dealt us a substantial blow, which was the COVID pandemic. And that highlighted the need for equity-based solutions. So this is really trying to understand how can we make all communities benefit as much as possible. And I'll just give you a very quick example of this. If we, for example, take a look at, we all know that vehicles are generally the largest source of pollution. So one may consider, well, what if we electrify the vehicular fleet? Let's give out some incentives, which have been going on for electric vehicle adoption. Well, only a certain segment of the population is actually going to be able to take advantage of those incentives, whereas some other community members may not be able to afford even with these incentives. So that's not really necessarily an equitable solution. So this is where we start to focus on how can we best improve everyone's chance at having a healthier environment. We may be very familiar with this conceptually, that the west side of Salt Lake County is sociodemographically challenged. We know that the income is substantially lower. We know also that many of the community members are minority origin. And so because of that, they may also have less access to some resources, particularly if English is not their first language. Many studies have taken place showing that English learners tend to take longer to understand certain health hazards such as air pollution. So we know that the West Side is particularly vulnerable for many environmental hazards that they may not be aware of. So one of the impetus and one of the ways that we really want to start to, first we need to quantify the problem before we even try to generate a solution. So now the Utah Division of Air Quality operates regulatory monitoring sites, which are highlighted here on they're yellow circles. However, as you can see, those are just individual points. So back in 2014, a colleague at the University of Utah, Dr. Logan Mitchell, he had this great idea of why don't we put air quality sensors on the track trains? Because now we can cover a much larger area. And fortunately, uh, the driver comes free because the trains are going to be operating. So this collaboration with UTA really paved the way to getting much more granular spatial and temporal data as well. And so we've operated that network now since really 2015 onwards. So now we are really coming on to almost a decade worth of data. However, we can see that there are substantial gaps that still remain. So then the next collaboration, and this was really an idea from a former HEAL colleague, Michael Shea and I, we sat down one day and we said, oh, we put these sensors on buses as well. And really what we realized was, well, first of all, we didn't have electric buses at the time. I think we we got together maybe 2018 or so, and the electric buses had not quite arrived to the fleet. But then when he moved on to his position in Salt Lake County, that's when the buses started to arrive, and we decided, well, now is the time. They're electric buses. The reason why we couldn't do this on natural gas or diesel buses is because the exhaust would simply overwhelm the signal. So then we started a collaboration between Salt Lake County, Salt Lake City, UTA, the Utah Division of Air Quality, the University of Utah, and HEAL. And we now have 7 buses operating, and they're running multiple routes. This was an image that we took back last year, actually, in February, where we can really start to see some disparities. By the way, this is all color coded according to air quality. And as you can see, that the west side is much more yellow. Again, the inversion hadn't quite set in strongly enough, but this is one of the best images that we have of that. And we get data real time. Uh, if you are familiar with UTA's routes, you can see that the route there on the west side, of course, we do have the tracks operating as well, but the bus route on the west side is the 509 route, and that primarily serves the west side. It goes on the west side of Salt Lake City and ends at West Valley, as you can see. This is an EPA environmental justice grant that HEAL was awarded, and what we are doing is now we're trying to communicate some of these findings to the broader community. If you squint a little bit and you know where your house is, you can try to maybe interpolate and try to figure out what your air quality is, but that's a little bit difficult. So what we're trying to do, and we're developing this upcoming year, is part of an environmental dashboard, an air quality dashboard, and we'll also develop this for temperature that really fills in more of a heat map. So now one can make decisions such as, if I really want to go for a run and I know it's inversion, which park across Salt Lake County has the better air quality, so I'm exposed to less pollutants. So these kind of decisions will now be able to be made using this research grade data. So this, I want to be very clear, this is research grade sensors. So these are high quality sensors that we use for our projects, along with the regulatory sensors, which are the ones operated by the Division of Air Quality. So it's reliable data that is robust and has been tested over many years. Many of these sensors are actually what we call FEM, which are federal equivalent methods. So they're very comparable to the regulatory, which we consider the gold standard for measurements. So one project that we collaborated on with Utah State University, with also Salt Lake City, and Roland Hall, we measured temperature, and because we also have the air quality sensors. This was we looked at July 17th, 2023, so just past summer, when there was a heat dome event. And we can now really start to see the disparities in terms of both air quality as well as temperature. So the left panels, they show up top the temperature below the ozone levels at 9 a.m. Now, ozone at 9 a.m. is not necessarily very high, but if we look at the temperature, now we really start to see that there's a substantial difference really between the east and the west side of the 509 route. When it gets to the hotter part of the day, so around 1 p.m., now we see substantial differences, almost doubling of ozone between the east and the west, as well as temperature. It really shows a very nice, very clear pattern, which now obviously the temperatures are much higher. And we can see almost approximately an 8 to 10 degree Fahrenheit difference. However, because the temperatures are so high, this is really a difference between being at just a little bit over 100 degrees Fahrenheit to in the lower 90s. So this is a substantial problem, especially when we consider that many of the hotter areas also include homes that do not have, or have a high, or have a lower amount of central air within their homes. They may be cooled by some coolers, window units, or really nothing at all. And in addition to that, some of those homes that do have access to central air, we've looked at income and poverty index, and it's likely that some of those homes, while they may have central air, they may not be able to run it because they may not be able to afford some of the electricity bills. So this is where we really start to focus on disadvantaged communities and the most vulnerable communities, because we're all neighbors and we really should be considering everyone when we're trying to look for solutions. When we start to look at some other tangible outcomes, some of the work that we've led studies third grade students' proficiency in math and English language arts here in Utah. There are standardized tests, and we found that there are substantially lower test scores in communities after they face inversion events, particularly. And we've also found that there are higher levels of absences following poorer quality events, and not necessarily extremely elevated events, but just enough where I always like to say no pollution is good pollution. So it's not where we can say, for example, oh, it's only yellow air quality. That's not a problem at all. It is an amount of pollution. And that's something that down the line, cumulative exposure is almost as bad as having just one very high pollution event exposure. So wanted to show something that's now starting to really get a lot more attention, which are dust events. So this is a dust event that we encountered in late December, actually, and I think this was uh, 2018. And you can see how, again, there's a view from the University of Utah looking towards downtown, and we actually lose the entire view of downtown in a second. Here, we don't really see any of it. Now, unfortunately, due to our changing climate, we're seeing larger amounts of both dust events and wildfires. And this is something that, unless we make some drastic changes, this trend is going to continue. So, as I promised earlier, I was going to discuss a little bit of the economic impacts. And when we looked at absences essentially on school children, there are three impacted groups. Schools are budget $40 a day per student. So when a student is absent, that money is not used to educate a student. Remember, there's a 2018 study, so the average wage then was about $23 an hour. Let's round it up to 25. So now if a student is absent in a very acute manner, meaning that the parents didn't have time to account for that, and that means that that family is earning about $200 less. They're losing that amount of income that particular day because the parent is staying home. Back then, 56% of students in Salt Lake City School District depend on free and reduced meals. Now that number is closer to 70. And I also lowballed and said, well, that's a loss of say $5 a day that the family now has to use to feed the child. So altogether, we're seeing a loss of about $205 just for the family themselves. And then here's this other really interesting term called economic multiplier. This, again, a very low level number. There's the lowest we could come up with, 2.5 times. The economic multiplier simply described is what is that factor that we scale up someone's wages to see the full impact on the economy. So let's say that you need, say, $10,000 worth of work done on your home. And so that's what the contractor says. They tell you that it's going to cost you $10,000. Well, the contractor's not making that a salary. The contractor is going to be making about $4,000. The rest is going into materials, into transportation, into taxes. So really 2.5 times of that goes towards a greater economy. So now if we take into account that parent salary, the one that's absent, and then we multiply it by 2.5 times, we come up to an estimated impact of about $452,000 a year. So that is the economic loss to due to just school children absences just in the Salt Lake City School District, directly tied to air pollution. With this data, I approached Representative Mark Wheatley, and he was able to pass in 2019 House Bill 0344, which provided stock albuterol inhalers at every single school in Utah. Because what that meant was that now kids who may have had an exacerbation after playing outside during a poor quality day could go to the central office there at the school and take a puff of the inhaler with a spacer for hygienic reasons, and ideally stay in school and not have to go to hospital, not have to go home for the rest of the day. And this is again a very environmental justice, social justice policy, because what happens is many kids of lower income communities or families, they may not have access to asthma medication. I take 3 medications a day, but many kids may not be able to take any of the preventive medicine, and so they may rely on emergency inhalers simply to get by and simply to get through the day. So this is something that really is gratifying to see how all this research was put into action and made a policy. I'm currently the chair of the asthma task force from the Department of Health and Human Services here for the state of Utah. And we're putting together, we're writing the manuscript of the impact on the first 3 years of this program. And it's really great to see the data that uh, the inhaler was used in many school districts, and as a result, 0 students had to be sent home. So of every student that was given the inhaler, no student had to go home and they could stay in school, thus really narrowing that educational gap and allowing kids to stay in school, which is critical. So I mentioned that I also look at temperature variability. If you take a look here at this map of Salt Lake County, we can see in the blue outline is Salt Lake City. Ignore the top 3 gray dots because those are very close to the Great Salt Lake, so they will have some differences, but we can see that gradient from east to west is just substantially warmer. We're seeing differences, and this is, again, I think this was 2019 data. The hottest 8 years on record have been the last 8 years. And as I'm analyzing this past summer's data, this differences are substantially greater because, again, the west side of Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County, it's much more built up. There's less green spaces. Uh, there are less large parks. And what happens during the day, it's basically what we call the brick oven effect. The sun radiates on all this concrete, on all this asphalt, and warms them up. And then at night, that radiates back out. And if you remember how I was mentioning that many of these communities may have less access to air conditioning, then that just becomes something that's a public health hazard, because really at the cellular level, the human body should be sleeping at lower than 80 degrees Fahrenheit at night. And we've seen many nights where the temperature does not drop. And in addition to that, the homes themselves are also warm. So if there's no way to cool them, then people are being exposed to really unhealthy levels of temperature at night when they should be resting, when they should be recovering for the next day. A few years ago, a team led by Isabella Ergo and Dr. Abbott at BYU put together this great team to look at the economic impacts of air pollution. So we wanted to look at not just human health, because that's human health and economic costs here, as you can see on the title, but we looked at things such as brain drain. Many, for example, tech workers, just not necessarily to pick on them, but other highly skilled workers come to Utah. They survive through water inversion and say, you know what, I'm not going to raise my family here. I have personally lost multiple colleagues at the University of Utah who said, this is not really great air quality. I don't want to raise kids here. And they leave. So there are direct economic costs. There are also costs that are associated, for example, with tourism. I mean, this is not, if we see the picture, if I as a tourist see this picture of the pollution, I'm going to probably go somewhere else because I don't want to expose myself or my family to that kind of air. So this is really a synthesis of all of these outcomes that are detrimental to Utah as a whole, not just from the human health side, as I mentioned, but the economic costs as well. So just to tie things up here, I know I've primarily focused here on air quality and temperature, but if we look at what we call the environmental, the exposome, this is what we're exposed to: air quality, water, light and sound pollution, uh, food accessibility and temperature, these plus two that I always like to bring about. So food accessibility, things such as food deserts are very detrimental to health. We really need to be having access to fresh produce. And many communities again, primarily on the West Side, primarily the more vulnerable communities, do not have access to fresh produce and other healthy food options. And also, when we look at temperature, that's also a modifier, as I've mentioned before. I want to always emphasize that this is not a work that's just done by me. There's a substantial team here, many collaborators and contributors. And normally, if this was live, I would take all your questions, but I always want to acknowledge all the funders that have made this research possible. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Daniel, Dr. Mendoza. I really appreciate that presentation, and I'm going to ask you to stick around for just a couple questions that I'll ask you at the end. I'm just going to share my screen over to my presentation. So you've heard a lot about the problems that we face here in Utah, and here particularly on the Wasatch Front. And the question is, in the solution space, then what do we do from here? And from the HEAL perspective, some of the things that we do are the following. We use the regulations and the institutions that we have already to protect Utah's environment and its people. But at the same time, we don't assume that that is enough. We don't assume that the institutions themselves are perfect. And we also don't assume that the regulations themselves are strong enough. So in many cases, we're actually working at the institutional level, at the regulatory level, to ensure that those things are both better enforced and that they are strong enough to protect our health. As Dr. Mendoza mentioned, we have these specific ambient air quality standards, but really there's no really great level of air pollution. And for me, raising a 2.5-year-old in this state, I know that on a day when perhaps my phone is telling me that it's moderate out there, that isn't good enough for me, which is why I keep plugging away at this work. Secondly, here at HEAL Utah, we really build evidence-based policy solutions for environmental health problems alongside communities across the state. So this happens on the Wasatch Front, but also in places like the Uinta Basin, in places like St. George, in places like Price, Utah, in places like Moab. And when we're doing our evidence-based policy, we're working with researchers like Dr. Mendoza and other ones to ensure that the policies that we're building are not only fitting the communities who are going to have to deal with the consequences, but that they are actually based on the best available science. We also amplify voices, and we bring allies to work effectively together. We ensure that the right people are in the room, whether or not they're by default environmental advocates, to answer the questions at hand. So if there's a housing issue that is tied in with, say, I-15 expansion or transportation or clean air, then we try to make sure that those advocates are also in the room and that they have a voice. And across the board, we bring people into the process because we truly believe that the only way forward towards building better policy and a better environment here in Utah is to have a healthy democracy. And we've seen that under threat in recent years. But we believe that by bringing people into those public comment processes, by ensuring that they know how to go and find their legislator up at the state level, as well as how to show up at a community town hall or a city council meeting and speak up and make their voice heard, that is critical to ensure that the processes and the institutions that we have in place actually reflect the people that they affect. So we've been doing this, and we've already taken the initial steps into these new initiatives. Hopefully, some of the heat-related grants that we're working with Daniel on will come through. But as we move forward, we do know that since we were formed 25 years ago, there's been this through line of commitment to protecting the environmental health of people in Utah, and a sustained belief that in order to have healthy people, you need to have a healthy democracy, and that in order to have that, you have to have a healthy environment, and in order to have that, you have to have a healthy and functioning democracy. So that is why we focus on amplifying the voices of the public and making sure that they have a part in the critical policy decisions that affect their future. At the same time, HEAL is a different organization than we were. We are more representative of the communities we are now working with in our staff and in our board, that we still have a long way to go. There's a whole yearbook's worth of people. This was really for Sophia Nicholas, but she wasn't in the room that night, who have started their careers at HEAL, who have gone on to other careers in the city at the county, and at many other environmental organizations. But in order to be the effective and professional organization that is currently needed in the space, to fulfill what is being asked of us by groups like the folks who reached out to us for I-15 work, and to be the organization that we can be, we need to be a place where people can not just start, but also build their careers. And that need for financial sustainability is what brings me to our third objective out of our strategic planning process. Over the last couple of years, our membership and our reach has grown tremendously. We have 20,000 plus supporters across the state, and in some cases, even outside of the state. We have more and more young people from a variety of backgrounds who have tremendous energy and passion to engage with our work and who are a real resource, but they may not yet have the financial resources to support us. That's why we were here. That's why we were here last week, and this is why we are here on Zoom tonight. Because we need you, the people who have supported us over the decades, to help lead the way. We're doing the work. And with your support of our financial sustainability, we can continue to advance health equity here in Utah. Another point that I need to bring up is that a recent New York Times article highlighted the challenges of the space that we're really working in. Groups like Natural Resources Defense Council, even groups like Environmental Working Group, are facing challenges in funding that are common to us. So groups like NRDC have recently left the nuclear toxics and environmental health work that has been some of their bread and butter over the decades, because most of the money out there is actually going to address the very real existential threat of climate change. There's a really good reason for that. At the same time, it leaves a gap though. Environmental public health still matters, even as we rapidly decarbonize, build out renewable infrastructure, connected grids and storage, and efficiency. And so instead of focusing on solutions that sacrifice communities who don't have a loud enough voice along the way, we need to find a better way going forward. That is one reason that we work on transportation now. A recent study that came out in 2023 showed that while there's likely to be an elevated need for lithium mining in order to create batteries for EVs, as well as for the electric transition and the massive amount of electricity that we need across the board, if we were to build a public transit system that looked more like Europe's, we could reduce our need for lithium by 40 to 80%. That is huge. It's not just about the energy in that case. It's actually about the entire environmental footprint, the entire environmental life cycle that affects more people when we need more resources. So by creating efficiencies, by creating better systems that allow people to get along and get around, not just inside their cars, but in a really accessible, friendly, and usable public transit system, means that we have a better democratic society as a whole, and that people are able to enjoy their lives and live in a better way. In so many cases, when you talk to people in frontline communities, they know what they need already. So HEAL is here to use our expertise and relationships to help translate that vision and knowledge into effective, durable policy solutions. We can bring people together and we can align them towards this common goal. HEAL is the organization here in Utah that is willing to take on the tough fight, the complex problem that no one else wants to deal with, whether that is nuclear energy or I-15 or transportation and the vehicle emissions sector. But we're also always willing to have those critical conversations with anyone across the political spectrum. And we continue to make sure that we talk to Democrats, independents, Republicans in every issue that we do. It's not about the politics for us, it's about the end goal. So I'm going to refer back to the NuScale victory for a second here, because what that took was creative thinking, work across political boundaries. As you might imagine, we don't necessarily have a lot in common with Utah Taxpayers Association, but because we had a common goal in mind, we were able to form a campaign that used data to look at what messaging was actually effective for people, as well as to then create the outreach to individual communities that translated these concerns that we had around cost and risk of those nuclear developments. But beyond that, what it actually took over those 6 to 7 years was donors who had the patience and attention span to see the fight through to the end. Because of that, it's a shared victory with our entire community. So what I'm asking you is to ensure that we can continue this critical work going forward. And thank you so much for listening through to this point. And the most important thing for me at the end of the year here is to ensure that you as donors feel heard and that you feel like you have an effective open communication line to us. We want to know what you care about. We want to know what questions we have, and we want to provide more opportunities to connect with you directly.